The gallery and I were honored to be asked by a few different people from the AAA to do a founders show. We have handled 1930s, 40s abstraction since the early 2000s. The first show we did was on at our gallery when we were on 76th Street, and most of the works were yay big. This show has got the biggest works of our shows, so I hope you will come and see it. So today for my talk, I'm focusing on sort of what were some of the major factors of the AAA forming and kind of what successes they did have in the 30s and 40s. So at our gallery, we're saying the works are 1936 to 1950. We have one work from 1958, and we have one work from 1934. So we're taking a little license, but it's a pretty tight selection of works from the period I'm going to be discussing. So without further ado, the AAA was formed in November 1936. It started as a group of young artists looking to get enough people together to get an exhibition at the Municipal Art Society. You had to have over 20 artists to be considered for that. It was a public exhibition space run by the WPA. And that initial effort snowballed into 39 members, signing the first prospectus in January 1937. The group was formed for the Municipal Art Society, but as it gained speed, it was really formed as a reaction against the museums that were comfortable showing European modernism, but for the Americans, it was all about American scene painting, so narrative realism. And they felt like it was important to show that American abstraction had a place. Sorry, I'm not following my script at all. That was an interesting part of the research, was that the group was saying, yes, there was Arthur Dove, there was the Stieglitz group in the teens and 20s, but there was a need for abstraction to continue. And most of the critics at the time felt like abstraction was this blip, and we were going to go back to realism. So here are photos from that first exhibition. The first exhibition was very well documented, probably George L.K. Morris, but other artists had cameras at that point, so there may be a few sources. And there's a few that I hadn't seen as much as others. So here you've got Bolotowski and Albers, which is pretty neat. The group, when it was first formed, had a 35-year age gap. Rosalind Bengelsdorf, born in 1916, was the youngest member, and A.E. Gallatin, born in 1881, was the eldest. It was also very interesting to see how there were some artists from long-established American families, like Gallatin, George L.K. Morris, Malcolm Green, and Alice Trumbull Mason. And then there was a whole host of new or recent immigrants. There was a contingent that had studied in Europe, like Bolotowski, Werner Dreyfus, Malcolm Green, Harry Holtzman. But there was also a younger group, including Byron Brown, Ibram Lasso, Alice Trumbull Mason, Ad Reinhardt, Louis Schenker, and David Smith, that had only studied in the US. The artists were diverse in their politics, social standing, and fame. In their 1938 annual exhibition catalog, the opening text read, The membership of this group is homogeneous to the extent of its recognition of mutual problems and limitations, and in its willingness to cooperate in the presentation and solution of these problems. We are, as in any group, heterogeneous and diverse in our concepts. And then it went on to say, abstract, like many other words, is too often used as an idiosyncratic suggestion rather than a concept which defines particular values. To understand abstract art is, in reality, no more a problem than an understanding any and all art. And this depends upon the ability of the individual to perceive essentials, to perceive that which is universally significant, and to evaluate the unity and relationship that is contained in any work. So the group, in its early formation, there was discussion about whether it would be like a school, if there would be a leader, if there would be a doctrine, and it was decided none of that would take place. It would be focused on creating exhibition opportunities for abstract artists. And because of that, they were able to achieve their goal pretty readily with a group that was at some points up to 50 members. They had a lot of different connections and used a lot of different means. So here is Gertrude Green, or Peter Green, was the first and perhaps only paid member of the AAA. She manned the desk at their first show. And when I was, we represent the Charles Green Shaw estate. And when we first took it on, I read all of his journals. And he frequently would say, spoke with Mrs. Green for 45 minutes. So I think she probably did a lot of talking during that show. They also had a questionnaire, which I found Elizabeth McCausland was a supporter of abstraction. She had a close relationship with Irene Rice Pereira, and she produced the questions in the Springfield Weekly Republican. So the questions were about interest in abstraction, what they thought of abstraction. And Susan Larson, whose dissertation on the group is the best, most comprehensive source, and is really an astounding example of scholarship because she recorded so many oral histories of early members. She said that in the questionnaire, 1/2 of those who reacted negatively to abstract art said it was too cerebral, and the other 50% complained it was too emotional. And I think a lot of art has had that problem for a long time. In the early exhibitions, there was an emphasis on publications as a way to have some kind of record that the audience could take away. Much kind of like now with the 80th and the 90th anniversaries, there was an effort to both record the history of the group and also defend abstraction. This was a quote from the little pamphlet for the 1940 annual exhibition, which I liked. I liked the idea that any of these things are puzzles. These guys really did have to figure out how to defend an art form to a public that knew nothing about about a painting that didn't tell a story. So I thought this was a good quote from Morris. And then a scholar shared this image a while back, and I think it's pretty indicative of the storyline that ended up winning in the early members of American Abstract Artists, which is that abstraction is a direct line from Cézanne and Cubism. And this was the story that won out with the AAA. It wasn't necessarily where it started. There was more expressionism and well, my bias against messy paintings in the early years than we sort of, or at least I feel like it's presented. So I was thrilled when I came across Louis Schenker's website that has an archive of his work with the AAA. And lo and behold, there's multiple figures in the room, which generally we don't see in the books from the 1980s when this period was first being rediscovered. So I thought that was interesting. And then I looked, and there's 2 full-on figures in the first portfolio that they did. This portfolio shows the mission of the AAA, that they really wanted to have something to give away to people. You had to pay for it, but it was very cheap. It was done at Kane Press, which was an art school that Vaclav Vitlichel was teaching at the time. That was mainly for Upper East Side ladies that lunch. So Vitlichel was able to borrow the press and probably have none of that noticed. And then even 1939, this is Rosalind Bengelsdorf, whose work is impossible to find. I would love to have one in my show, but it's not going to happen. So here's another. This is Harry Bowden, who I've never seen an example of his work. And he was more of the sort of Hoffman style that didn't end up fitting with that narrative. And so in this 1939 yearbook, there was a questionnaire that the artists were supposed to answer. And it's interesting to see who answered how and what. I think Rosalind Bengelsdorf follows most of the rules, which included, since when have you been painting abstractly? And for the majority of these artists, it's 1934 to 36. So it's really something that they just started. Okay. So they ended up getting decent press coverage as time went on, including this 1939 New York Times article, which I feel like if today we could get 3 images of abstract paintings reproduced, would be really nice to see. So there is always talk about how the critics were relatively dismissive or negative, but I feel like the fact that they produced so many images and reviews indicates that they were paying attention. So what shaped the early AAA? The WPA mural division in New York, Hans Hofmann and A.E. Gallatin's Gallery of Living Art come up over and over again in the writing as the influences. And my gallery, we're very used to handling 1930s, 40s realism. Often we will have artists that participated in the Treasury Department program, which was commission-based, not need-based. This mural division had always been a mystery to me because it's mentioned as a way that these artists met. And there weren't that many projects, but it was really an important movement for the group. So the Federal Art Project was truly an impressive program, actually fully across the country. It included the Index of American Design, which documented all different types of craft. And it created art centers across the country. Some of them have now turned into proper art museums. But there really was an effort to make art available to all. So here is Arshil Gorky, the most famous non-member of the AAA. We all know the infamous story that he marched out and de Kooning followed because he thought he should be in charge, not Harry Holtzman. And fortunately, it ended up that neither of them were permitted to be in charge. And I think Belcom Green was the first political choice as chairman because he had more neutrality than those two guys. And then there is Mayor LaGuardia. You can really get a sense of his size. Looking at these proposals. So Burgoyne Diller got to take over this division. He was a very young man. And he was part of there were 3 WPA projects before the one that lasted from 35 to 42. And he participated in the first one, the Public Works of Art program. And he quickly recognized that as an abstractionist, he was not going to get to have a stable income. So he very quickly switched to the administrative side of the WPA, which was a very smart move. And so through the different products, or 2 different programs happened within about 12 months. And by the time the formal federal art project, WPA, began, Diller had managed to become in charge of the mural division. Initially, it was him and a realist. They were supposed to divide it up, and eventually he took over the whole thing. He hired Harry Holtzman as his assistant. So this was all in 1935, pre the founding of the AAA. And over time, they ended up including Rosalind Bengelsdorf, Ilya Bolotovsky, Harry Bowden, Byron Brown, Belcom Green, Hanani Harari, Paul Kelpie, Louis Schenker, Esper Slobodkina, Albert Swindon, John von Wick, and Jean Zeron. So a pretty good representation of AAA artists. Here's Ilya Bolotovsky. He's very adorable. And you can see here, so this is from 1938 at the Federal Art Gallery. They seem like those are from the same picture, but they say they're not. But you can see where Bolotovsky is combining geometric and biomorphic painting, which we at the gallery argue is a very American approach to have the chutzpah to say, you know what, I like Mondrian, I like Miro, I'm going to paint the 2 together. So the first abstract project was Arshile Gorky's murals for the Newark Airport, which were executed from 35 to 37. 2 of those panels are now in the Newark Museum, and we've learned that there's a mosaic after one in JFK Terminal 4. The next was the Williamsburg Housing Project, which we are fortunate to get to know because the murals have been saved and are now on view at the Brooklyn Museum. That was 1936. And then what I've got here is the WNYC Studios in 1939. This was probably the most glamorous of the commissions, and most of these murals are somewhere in the municipal building, the Staten Island courthouse, and the Stuart Davis got scooped up by the Met and is in the musical instrument galleries. So here's the Archives of American Art has digitized all the photos from the Federal Art Project's photography division, which makes it very fun because there's a brief period of this work that's very well documented. Albert Swindon is one of the artists we have found very difficult to locate works by. He and Belcom Green had a studio fire in 39, and most of the works, the earlier works, were destroyed. We were fortunate to get 2 gouaches in our show that have come through the family. So there's the black and white. And then just to give you a sense, there's the color version that's at the Brooklyn Museum. One of the really interesting projects was for the Chronic Disease Hospital. Now, Burgoyne Diller had to push for each of these projects to get executed. They had money to sort of run the program, but he needed to find venues that were willing to put up the materials and the space. In his oral history, they talk about how he sometimes had to call these decoration rather than abstract art, and that he was sitting in a meeting with the Newark Art Commission, and one of the members said, "Is this abstract art?" And it ended the project. So instead, these guys got the mental wards, Rikers Island prisons. So here is Swindon's mural proposal for the Chronic Disease Hospital. Each of these rooms were circular. They were the day rooms for the patients. And so you end up with images like this. So the patients, there had been a representative mural beforehand, and they had defaced the ladies. So the group was on board with abstraction happening in this hospital. It's very flattering for abstract artists. But the abstract artists loved it. And then here to give you a sense of how bright the colors are, these were also considered lost. They've been found. And this is an article from 2001. But these murals are now part of the Cornell Tech campus. I have yet to go out there, but there's specific places where at least two of them are. Most of these works were on oil on canvas mounted to wall. They weren't painted on site. They were painted in studios. And so some of them that were lost have just been whitewashed years and years. That's what happened to Arshil Gorky's murals very quickly. And then others were removed, put into basement storage, and lost. So it takes a lot of conservation and money to restore these murals, but we're always thrilled when it happens. So here's one that apparently did not make it. I would love for someone to tell me they found it. These are Jean Zeron's murals for a non-denominational chapel at Rikers. It was supposed to be for the Christian Scientists and the Jewish prisoners and visitors. So again, that's when they decided abstraction was the best way to go. So they had no representation of figures, but nothing too offensive for the Christian Scientists. We get paintings like this by Ilya Bolotowsky from 1935. You can see how the murals have really made them think about painting as architecture. Belcom Green writes about painting like architecture as a way to sort of root the abstraction in some form of reality. So there's a lot of linearity in the mid-30s for the group. And then, and as a side note, the relationship with MoMA was more complicated than the single protest in 1940 that's gone down in history really was. So many of these artists were actually included in an exhibition called New Horizons in American Art at MoMA in 1936, which was organized by Holger Cahill, who was the national director of the project. So many of these guys had been shown at MoMA, but in the context of public art. Okay, so the next mystery is the influence of Hans Hofmann. We hear over and over again how important he was as a teacher, and yet very few of the artists end up sort of painting in what we would consider a recognizable Hoffman student approach. So first, the inevitability of Hoffman being an influence. Even Joseph Albers studied with Hoffman prior to going to the Bauhaus. And then for the Americans, Václav Vitlačel, who has a relief seen here, and Karl Holty went to Munich in the 1920s to study with him and became sort of disciples. And when Vitlačel came back to New York to teach at the Art Students League in 1928, he sort of set the path for Hoffman to come in the early 1930s. Prior to Hoffman's arrival in New York, which is 1932, the important modernist teachers were Jan Matulka, Stuart Davis, and Abraham Wolkowitz. And Matulka was a particular influence for AAA artists like David Smith, Irene Rice Pereira, Dorothy Daner, Leo Lancis, and George McNeil. And in this show, so there's a Vitlačel relief. There was 1 year in the 1930s when everybody seemed to submit a construction for the annual exhibition, which was interesting to see. It was more than just Gertrude Green and Charles Greenshaw. Here is a Holty from 1938, very similar in the sort of biomorphic shapes to the installation photos at the beginning. And then Wilfred Zogbaum, who ended up becoming a sculptor teaching out in California at Berkeley. And then this strange group. There was a group of women artists from California that were not founding members, but they were very early members. And putting it all together, the connection was Hans Hoffman through Václav Vitlačel. So Dorothy Dralamine was a portrait painter. Her mother was a portrait painter. And Vitlačel ended up being in Berkeley teaching in the 1928 through 36 at various points. I have got to assume she studied with him because she went from portraits of children to making very textured work like this in a couple of years. And these women had shows themselves in California, mainly at like art clubs, but also occasionally at the San Francisco Museum of Art. They called themselves mural conceptualists. There was a lot of mouthful names in the 1930s. So there's Dorothy Dralamine. And then this is Janet Todd Young, who used presumably magazine clippings to create these abstracted cityscapes. So we brought these in for our show. They were sold within the first day. If anyone has any more of these, please let me know. So why did Hans Hoffman lose out with the AAA? And this is where I discovered my own bias in putting together the show, because I have a type of abstraction I gravitate to from the 30s, 40s. The edges are very defined. They can be biomorphic or geometric or constructions, but they're always pretty linear. And I came to understand it's because it's what A.E. Gallatin collected. So his gallery of living art was carved out of the NYU library study hall. He had 3 alcoves. So this is a bad image because it's a photo taken from a book. I can't find other images, but you get a sense of how small these alcoves were. But because they were in a library, they were accessible to the artists that lived around Washington Square. It was open till 10 p.m. every weekday. And it was the place to see Parisian art. So in this picture, it's got one of Gallatin's coups, which is Léger's The City. Most of the works were of a fairly intimate scale, but The City one of his Juan Miros, and Picasso's Three Musicians were huge standouts. And all of those works are now at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. NYU, perhaps not so smartly, took back those three alcoves in 43, claiming wartime need. And the Philadelphia Museum very happily offered a new home for the collection. So why we don't have more Hoffman? Well, Burgoyne Diller and Harry Holzman were two of Hoffman's assistants. They actually were his teaching assistants at the League and then at his own school. And then in 1934, they see a Mondrian painting that A.E. Gallatin had just purchased. I'm going to skip ahead, which is this painting. And they become devout de Stijl artists. So they kind of set the tone. And the reason, now going back, sorry, the collection was so important was these artists, the ones that were staying in the US, and they did not have money to travel to Europe, were mainly buying the Cahiers d'Art and going through it with great excitement every issue. Now, this is another reason why we say the American artists have such a great sense of color, because they had no idea what the colors were. So here you've got, this was just randomly based on what I could find digitized, an extensive article on Juan Miro. The magazine included Renaissance art. It was broad, but it did also include recent Parisian artists. And so these guys were looking and discussing these black and white images. So when Gallatin buys one and brings it to New York, it makes a big difference for these artists. And I came across a little story, I think probably Susan Larson, that again, when Gorky was still in the mix, Byron Brown and he got into a fight and he said, "You don't understand the Cahiers d'Art because you don't speak French." And he made him feel very bad. And then Rosalind Bengelsdorf, oral history, comments that Gorky didn't speak French either. So it was interesting to see, as I mentioned, in like 38 or 39, a lot of the artists started doing reliefs or constructions, not just paintings. And Gallatin was buying these in the mid-30s. So here's a Cesar Domela with aluminum stripes on it. So it becomes a three-dimensional object. And then Torres Garcia, who I think probably was behind Charles Greenshaw's multi-paneled paintings. And Gallatin was collecting his work relatively early in 32. And then even the constructivists come into the collection in the late 30s, and particularly for an artist like Charles Greenshaw, you see how he's incorporating the transparency and the planes very promptly. So Gallatin was a collector, but he also was an artist, and he formed a little group around him that included Charles Greenshaw, George L.K. Morris, who was another privileged person able to go back and forth to Paris. He was the curator for the Gallery of Living Art, and John Farren. So these artists, many of them showed at Pierre Matisse Gallery in New York as their New York presence. And when Gallatin found out that Alfred Barr was not including many Americans in the 1936 exhibition Abstract Art and Cubism, or Cubism and Abstract Art, he set up his own show with Calder, Morris, Shaw, Farren, and Charles Biederman. Charles Biederman is another name that should have been a member of the group, but was not a joining kind of guy. So he's not in our show, even though we represent the estate. And Gallatin started painting in 1920. It's very hard to be a good painter, I imagine, when you're hanging out in Picasso's studio and buying amazing works. So we find Gallatin regularly goes back on his paintings multiple times. So this is a painting he started in 1940. It has 4 dates on the back of it because he just kept going at it. And in 1952, he had a show at Rosa Fried Gallery. So presumably he went back at this painting again for that show. So in the land of did the AAA make it? I argue that yes, they did, because their goal was to show their art to a broader public. And what is more public than the New York World's Fair? So a number of the artists were included in the major 1939 American Art Exhibition, which involved 1,200 works of art in painting, sculpture, and graphics from a pool of 25,000 works from across 36 states. So it was really this huge art gathering. And Stuart Davis was the selected voice for the modern artists. And the 12 artists from the AAA managed to be in that show. Byron Brown, Balcom Green, Carl Holte, George McNeil, George L.K. Morris, and Jean Zeron. And the abstract mural guys got to do murals for, again, the public health building. So here is Balcom Green's mural for the World's Fair, along with the study that he used. Now, like with everything at World's Fairs, these are all gone. So any kind of photo we have is great. And then here is Balcom Green working in his studio, and we can presume that the woman working next to him is probably his wife, Gertrude Green. Now, with the WPA, only one partner could be in the program. So Balcom and Gertrude wanted to stay together. So they did not divorce, which at Ilya Bolotovsky and Esper Slobodkina said, hey, let's separate and we can both be on the program. And Byron Brown and Rosalind Bengelsdorf were a couple and conveniently got married in 1943 when the program ended. So this program was pretty important to the livelihood of these guys. So I love this painting because it shows Balcom Green's technique of staining. And he is an artist who had a studio fire in 1940, comes back to work doing a whole different, looser style. And then presumably when this whole group starts getting rediscovered, Virginia Zabriskie does a show in the early 1970s, he goes back and uses his collages, which had not burned in the studio fire, to remake his 1930s paintings. Because he wanted to be part of the group, and he deserved to be part of a group. And the paintings are gorgeous. They're very assured, the color is great. And it's been a mystery of which of the paintings are from the 1930s and which are later works. And finally, I think I have found one 1930s painting. And it is encasing, not oil. It's a smaller scale than the later ones. And it does suggest that he was using stencils. So this is a very nerdy, early founders find. But the only known pieces from the 30s for him are at MoMA, the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, and one other that I'm now forgetting. So for the stature of Malcolm Green as one of the AAA's first presidents, it's nice to have him well represented for the show. To give you a sense of the mix, this is Louis Schenker's mural for the Public Health Building, and there's a very realistic narrative paint sculpture mural right behind him. These murals were reviewed by committees. So the Archives of American Art does have these proposals of where the mural was supposed to be, its sense of scale. And then this joyful Ilya Bolotovsky, I would kill to find this painting. We make do with a small collage that has the same kind of joy in it. And the mystery of the World's Fair, from reading Shaw's journals, I know that he and Ibram Lossow installed a sculpture at the World's Fair. I never knew if it was an approved sculpture or if it was them having some fun. And it ends up, the AAA did have an exhibition at the World's Fair in the second season. They had done all this work for the first season, and then in March, it was decided to do a second season. And the administrators just handed it off to the WPA and said, come up with programming for the next 4 months. So the AAA were not alone, but they did get to have 3 weeks exhibition at the fair. There are no photographs of this second year. I've got in contact with World's Fair collectors. Nobody has anything. So again, if you have something, let me know. So the only documentation we sort of do have is that Ibram Lossow and Charles Green Shaw designed this 3-dimensional sculpture. Now, both of them were thinking about kinetic sculptures since Byron Brown proposed that they put a sculpture outside their first exhibition as a publicity stunt. And then Byron Brown's solution was, instead of magnets or pulleys, they would just make somebody wear it up and down the street. So the idea got nixed. But Charles Green Shaw and Ibram Lossow managed to make a 3-dimensional sculpture involving a lot of pulleys. Who knows where it is? Denise Lossow was a great source, and she sent me this mock-up of Ibram Lossow's moving piece. We don't know who won, but there's some excitement. So the WPA did, in fact, travel some of the early AAA exhibitions. This was sort of some lore that I'd heard about, and they definitely did a show from 40 to 42 that went to a number of Iowa venues, Oklahoma, and other stops. And there probably were 2 shows because some went to established art museums. We have Charles Green Shaw paintings that have that sticker on the back. But then there also were these exhibitions that went to municipal art centers, and it was works by the American Abstract Artists Group and then reproduction drawings of the big Paris artists. So I did manage to find one local news source documenting this, because in the first week of our show, we had someone ask, what was the local response to these exhibitions? So then I had to find something. So there you go with the sort of early sources of how this group went around. I have lots more about MoMA, but we don't need to go into that. Yeah. I will finish quickly, though, with one gauge of success could be that when MoMA returned to abstraction in 1951, and did their abstract painting and sculpture in America. It included many AAA members. So we've got Byron Brown on the left and George L.K. Morris on the right. We've got Fritz Glarner, Carl Holte, Irene Rice Pereira. And we have a late Charles Green Shaw that is not my favorite. But they did end up getting MoMA's attention. And then what is going on right now, there's an exhibition of Louise Nevelson and Esther Slobodkina that was organized by the Arkansas Museum of Fine Arts. It's at the Chrysler Museum right now, and it's going to open at the New Britain Museum in July. Something that I'm very excited to announce is that Deborah Bricker-Balkin will do an Irene Rice Pereira exhibition at the Addison Gallery of American Art in 2028. It's going to come with a major publication. She's identified every Irene Rice Pereira out there. Pereira used a variety of materials. Some of you heard me talk about her before. She's a fascinating artist. And then there is a Swiss publisher that is going to produce a facsimile of the Plastique magazine, which is something that George L.K. Morris was involved in. It's come about because of the renewed interest and success of Sophie Tober-Arp. That's why this publishing house is interested, but we had to provide image rights because Charles Green Shaw is in it, George L.K. Morris is in it. So we are very pleased that this group is getting attention from the Europeans, finally.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.